It was too easy for early European immigrants to dismiss the traditions of the American Indians. It was our loss. The Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota Nation. History and Health, tonight on Call with the Prairie Doc. Good evening, and welcome to On Call with the Prairie Doc. There is a sad and misinformed attitude in the general population to dismiss the nation-to-nation relationship that the U.S. government has with each Indian nation. We fail to acknowledge the rich society and history, including medical practices of pre-Columbian America. But first, let's take a look at this week's Prairie Doc quiz question. The overall median age at the death in South Dakota is 76.5 years right now. However, for the American Indian in South Dakota, it is A, 48 years, B, 58 years, C, 68 years, D, 78 years. Viewers who call in the correct answer will be entered into a drawing to win a signed copy of our book, The Picture of Health. Each of my essays, originally written for this show, comes with a wonderful accompanying photograph by Dr. Judith Peterson. We will announce the answer and the winner at the end of the show. Remember, you only get 10 minutes to get your answer in. But we answer your questions as they're called in all evening or sent to us via Facebook or email. Call in questions to 1-888-376-6225 or send us an email to the address on the screen. Joining us tonight is dear friend Dr. Donald Warne, Chair and Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. He is also Director of Indians into Medicine, or InMed, at the University of North Dakota in Grand Forks. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Don, for joining us.
Yep, very happy to be here. Thank you for.
So this is your third visit. I mean, we did one 3 years ago from Rapid City, but it's just nice to have just you on the show. So you're Associate Dean of the School of Medicine.
Yeah, so at the University of North Dakota School of Medicine and Health Sciences, we have several associate deans as well, of course, a dean of the medical school. I'm the associate dean for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So my role, in addition to directing programs and teaching classes, also includes trying to increase diversity across the board with health sciences at University of North Dakota. And I'm, of course, director of the InMed program, or the Indians into Medicine program.
So we have a lot of that in North Dakota, South Dakota. What are the states where American Indians reside?
Well, we have American Indians, of course, throughout the nation, but there are several states that have higher concentrations of American Indians and Alaska Natives. For InMed, our original charter, starting in 1973, is focused on the states of North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Montana, and Wyoming. If we look at this map, we recognize that most American Indians and Alaska Natives are in the western half of the United States, and now there's only 7 states that have at least 3% American Indian or Alaska Native population. So that's Alaska, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. And for those who are from Alaska, I apologize. I know Alaska is not off the coast of California, but this is the best map that I have, of course. But there are reasons why our population is distributed in the way that it is. And we have very few American Indians left in the Northeast. And that's not because we didn't like the East Coast or too much traffic that kept us away. Yeah. But in truth, the reason we have less American Indians in the Northeast in particular is because of colonization. And the original 13 colonies were not good for the Northeastern tribes. You may have heard of Amherst, Massachusetts, or Amherst College. Yeah. That's named after Lord Jeffrey Amherst, who was a colonial governor. And he's very famous in Indian country. He's the one who ordered the distribution of blankets from a smallpox hospital to the regional tribes with the purpose of killing them. So you can actually Google Amherst and smallpox and see the letters that he wrote ordering the distribution of blankets and to the regional tribes. Yes.
Wow, I had heard that there wasn't proof that had happened, but we've got the letters.
Yeah. Actually, if again, Google is a verb, right? So we can Google these things. But if you Google Amherst and smallpox, you can actually pull up the letters that were written. And very clearly, he ordered the distribution of blankets from the smallpox hospital with the purpose of killing American Indians in the Northeast. So it really was an attempt at genocide.
It was.
Happened up there. Yeah.
What about the Trail of Tears? That's another East sent him to Oklahoma story.
Exactly. So in 1830 was the Indian Removal Act. And that's why we also have far less American Indians in the southeast of the United States. So those populations were removed from their homelands and put into what is now Oklahoma. So that's more commonly known as the Trail of Tears. And in that process, many of the tribal members refused to leave their homelands, so they stayed in their homelands, and many did get removed to Oklahoma. So that's why we have this interesting dynamic now in the United States, where we have Seminoles in Florida, Seminoles in Oklahoma. We have Cherokees in North Carolina, Cherokees in Oklahoma, Choctaws in Mississippi, Choctaws in Oklahoma. And of the 38 federally recognized tribes in Oklahoma, only 4 are actually from Oklahoma. The rest are from other parts of the nation.
They were imported.
They were removed, yeah. So that's why we have that interesting dynamic of far less American Indians in the eastern half of the U.S., but concentrations, of course, here in the Dakotas, including North Dakota and South Dakota.
And now we don't have many in Minnesota because of the War of 1862, isn't that right?
Yeah, the Dakota War of 1862 did move a lot of the Dakotas west of the Red River. And I do have another map that shows really this region and thinking about the distribution of population. And the Oyate, which is the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota peoples, are comprised here in what is now, of course, the Dakotas, as well as western Minnesota and parts of Canada. So another term for Nakota is Assiniboine. You may have heard of Assiniboine tribe or Assiniboine River. That's the Nakota people. And the Dakota originally were in what is now western Minnesota. And in that process of the War of 1862, the tribal members were pushed to the west, so west of the Red River. So it really is a terrible history of warfare and, unfortunately, really bad outcomes. And when we think about the reason this is called South Dakota, it's because colonization came from the east. So they encountered the Dakotas first, so that's why it was called the Dakota Territory. Interestingly, if colonization had come from the west, they would have encountered the Lakotas first. So we'd be in South Lakota instead of South Dakota, and I'd be at UNL instead of UND.
Oh, UNL.
Yeah, the University of North Lakota. Yeah, so just looking at that history and how populations were engaged, that's why we have the Dakota Territory. A lot of people don't even think about that. Why is it called South Dakota?
South Dakota.
Yeah.
Well, a friend of mine who is the had been the state geologist and said that he had learned that the Lakota horse culture was only a 300-year experience. That they didn't have horses until a certain period of time, and then they developed a horse culture. Could you tell me more about that?
Yeah, so the horses were brought over from Spain,
right?
So we didn't have horses historically many centuries ago, but they were adopted into the culture, and actually we had quite a thriving horse culture, and it really did change the dynamics of our people. What's interesting is that the Dakotas, being in western Minnesota, were kind of more of a woodlands type culture. The Lakotas more out onto the plains, more of a plains culture, and a lot of people kind of have a hard time understanding how could that be that one tribe is kind of overlapping both. And it's kind of like saying, well, we have Americans who live in West Virginia and Americans who live in Los Angeles. How can that be? You know what I mean? Say, well, of course, we're the same group, but we could live in different parts of the territories. So we did have really a lot of diversity of culture in American Indian and Alaska Native populations, but even within Oyate, we had diversity in terms of where we lived, and some differences in language and dialect, as well as some differences in culture, but a lot of commonality, a lot of things that brought us together.
One of the things at Lake Poinsett is this beautiful museum. And a lot of the museum is about arrowheads that were picked up by Harlan Olson, who really had championed the thing. And he had found 12,000 and 13,000 year old Clovis points that were on the head of spears. They didn't have arrows at that time. They had only spears, and they were killing mammoths.
Yeah.
And he's got perfect examples of those in the Lake Poinsett Museum.
Yeah.
But all of those arrowheads come from all over the United States. I mean, it's amazing. This arrowhead found at 3,000 years ago, or no, 3,000 years ago, came from mines in Colorado, there is this huge thought that there was a lot of trade, a lot of communication, a lot of culture that was going on before the epidemics that wiped out and sterilized the country.
Yeah, yeah, and there was a lot of trade going on among tribes for many, many centuries, and a lot of even international trade. There's evidence of, for example, feathers from birds like the macaw in South America that are used in ceremonies in New Mexico. And we have, for example, we use abalone shells in South Dakota. Those are not from here. So
I think,
there was a
I
significant.
think this is an abalone shell.
I think you're right. Yeah. So we had trade, across the tribal nations and really thriving economies. So I think there's almost a perception that we were just kind of stumbling and bumbling through history and barely surviving, but that's not the case. We had very complex societies, and unfortunately, after colonization started and was implemented, we saw a lot of devastation to our communities. But where I live now is in Grand Forks, North Dakota. And I do have another map kind of showing the area around Grand Forks that's really the confluence of the Red Lake River heading west and the Red River heading north. And at Grand Forks, that actually was a gathering point for Lakota and Dakota peoples. And the reason it's called Grand Forks is it is the confluence of those two rivers, the Red Lake River and the Red River. And every time I cross the bridge over that area of Grand Forks, I always think about what that must have looked like, 1,000 years ago, and what it looked like with 1,000 teepees and 10,000 people gathering there. And before we had highways, of course, the waterways were our systems of transportation. Yeah.
Now, you have one photo here with teepees at Grand Forks, right?
Yeah, that's actually not at Grand Forks. We don't have any photos from there, unfortunately. But when I think about the beauty of our culture and the beauty of our ways, and I think about what that must have looked like in what is now Grand Forks and how beautiful that must have been. And also the forks in Winnipeg was another gathering point for Lakota and Dakota people, and Nakota. So the forks in Winnipeg is the Red River heading north and the Assiniboine or Nakota River heading east, meeting at Winnipeg. And that whole region where I live now and where the University of North Dakota Medical School is located really is a sacred gathering point for our people.
Wow, I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
The river, Lake Traverse, goes south and then Big Stone goes north, or do I have it turned around? But there's a divide where it goes north and it goes south.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you know?
So that, and again, that's how we would our populations would come together in the summer months, and we'd have our gatherings and ceremonies, and that's when even multiple tribes would come together. And we do talk about the intertribal conflicts and some of the tribes that had adverse relationships with each other, but in truth there was also a lot more of intertribal trade and people working collaboratively and complex economies. It wasn't just simply, so one group is a friend, one group is an enemy. I mean, things evolved over time. And as I understand it, what I was taught from my uncles and elders is that we had many more of our tribal groups working collaboratively and surviving together, much more so than we do even today.
Yeah. Yeah. I wish we could have more collaboration between the tribes of all races in this country. Minnesota is and it sounds like an Indian name.
Yep, and actually most people don't know what the word Minnesota means, but it actually comes from two Dakota words. One is mani, which means water, and the other is shota, which means cloudy or smoking. So mani shota is literally this image where it appears like a cloud or smoke is rising off of the water. So a mani shota. And in what we now call Minnesota, with all of the waterways, with the rivers and the lakes, we see this time of year in the fall and in the spring when the temperatures change, we see literally the clouds or the smoke rising off the water. That's a lot of shota.
There's a lot of shota going on.
Yeah, there is.
This time of the year.
Yep.
You're from Kyle?
Yeah, Kyle, South Dakota.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, well, Kyle, the original name from the tribal perspective in Lakota is Prejutahaka, which means medicine root. And it was renamed Kyle, South Dakota, actually after Senator John Kyle. He was one of the first senators from the state of South Dakota. And he was actually a workers' rights advocate. So he actually wrote the legislation to establish Labor Day in the United States. So
wow.
Every time you get that Monday off in September, you can thank Kyle, South Dakota for having a 3-day weekend, actually. But, really but it's a fascinating history in that it's a medicine root. It's where we still gather a lot of our traditional medicines, a lot of our traditional healers, and the strength of our culture. There's a lot of that in what is now Kyle, South Dakota, but it's a tradition called medicine root, or Prejutahaka.
That's easy for you to say.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Well, let's talk a little bit about the illnesses that can occur in Native American, in American Indian. That's the proper, right? Native American is inappropriate because why?
Well, it's difficult to identify the best terminology. So if we look at it from a legal precedent perspective, Indian tribes are described in the U.S. Constitution, and we have an Indian Health Service, Bureau of Indian Affairs. But the reason we're called Indians is that Columbus thought he was in India. So because he was lost at sea, I'm an American Indian. It's kind of ironic.
Yeah, it is.
But Native American, actually the word America is named after Amerigo Vespucci, another Italian explorer. So when people are arguing, well, American Indian versus Native American, we're kind of arguing which Italian terminology do we prefer for ourselves. So I think they do it right in Canada. I like First Nations. I think it's a wonderful term for the tribes, or just indigenous peoples. But from a legal perspective, the race is American Indian and Alaska Native. And legally, Native American means American Indian, Alaska Native, also Native Hawaiian, and indigenous peoples to U.S. territory. So American Samoa, Samoans are Native Americans. And the groups in Guam, for example, those are also technically Native American. So when we say Native American, what we're actually including is American Indian, Alaska Native, and indigenous Pacific Islanders to the U.S. territories. So I prefer the term American Indian, but I think because of the legal precedent. However, I think indigenous is probably the better term for us.
Really, indigenous people that were here. So, reclaiming traditional foodways, that's an interesting topic. We'll have to talk about that more. It means going back to the original diet of your ancestors. In the documentary Return, Kibi Maga Kanti speaks about nutrition in the Northern Plains Indian population.
It's a story about how indigenous people began on this continent with an incredible food system. They domesticated most of the world's cultivated crops, and sadly, their food system was disrupted through a series of events that happened over a timeline. And the consequence of that food system disruption is their health declined. And now Native people suffer from high rates of chronic disease, diabetes, obesity, hypertension, cancer. And so we've seen this shift in our health directly corresponding to the shift in our food system. Many Native people eat very similar to the rest of America, which is very foreign for their bodies. For Native Americans, there are some foods that I call foreign. We never saw flour, wheat flour, until the government issued it to us. When we first saw wheat flour, this is after the Fort Laramie Treaty, and it was written into the treaty they were going to issue it to us, and they did. And they were going to take our land, and they were going to take our buffalo, and they did. When we first saw the sacks of flour, we took our knife and we cut the sack open and we dumped it on the ground because we could not eat powder. And so eventually, they say the pioneer women showed us when we were hungry, we were starving, how to use flour with skillet, fry bread. And so fry bread came into being. It spared us starvation, and we eventually adopted wheat. But our carbohydrates were corn varieties, bean varieties, squash, and potato or starchy roots. We had many starchy vegetables that were colorful. I call them the colorful carbs. And they work better for our bodies because they're more slowly broken down. One of the tools that we use is called My Native Plate. You need a variety of nutrients, and this captures most of those nutrients. In this plate, we have a carbohydrate. And carbohydrates are easily identifiable based on their appearance. They appear very pale, very starchy, which I guess is kind of white. But you need a carbohydrate as a fuel source. That's your primary fuel that your body burns on a regular basis. So we have a carbohydrate on the plate. We have a good source of protein. It looks like fresh meat that was just prepared, fresh beef, or it could be fresh chicken, maybe prepared with some herbs. And then we have some color. So color, this side of the plate looks very different than that side of the plate because you got red, green, yellow, bright colors. And those are found in the plants that we harvest or that we grow. The colors are actually antioxidants, and they do work with your cells to defend them from bad chemistry, things called free radicals. Corn, bean, potato, squash, under that food system, we never had diabetes. And so diabetes is a new thing. Just as we accepted flour under starvation, we can now turn away from flour and sugar.
This is your program. Your questions are key to the direction of our discussion. Please call in your questions to 1-888-376-6225 or send us an email to ask@prairiedoc.org. We love your questions. It's important to us. She was Kibby. Is an interesting lady. You said that you know who her father was.
Yeah, I know her very well, and her father was Ed McGaw, and his Lakota name was Eagle Man, and or Wambali Wichasha, and he unfortunately passed away a few years ago. But he wrote the book Mother Earth Spirituality, and was a wonderful elder. Knew him relatively well, and still use a lot of quotes from his books and some of the work
Mother
that they do.
Earth Spirituality.
Yeah, that was Kibby's father.
I've got to write that down. I'm sorry.
Kibby is one of the very few Lakota nutritionists. She's a registered dietitian.
Yeah. So let's talk about food. She made some important points. What would you say is important to remember about food groups and your culture?
Well, our traditional food systems were wonderful. So the sources of protein would include things like buffalo, and the nutritional profile and the protein concentration in buffalo is much better than what we find in corn-fed cattle, for example.
With all the fat.
Yeah, and actually, cattle are now bred and raised to have marbled fat within the meat, so it's not nearly as healthy as buffalo meat. And we had a lot of buffalo, of course, historically. So in my own family, I go buffalo hunting in a traditional way, actually, with some family friends.
With bows and arrows?
Not with bows and arrows, no, but there's a ceremony that's associated with with taking the life of an animal, and there's certain prayer and ceremony that's associated with that. And that is one interesting, huge difference between traditional food systems and modern food systems is we can go to the grocery store now and purchase hamburger or a steak that's neatly wrapped and looks sterile and it's under plastic, and we don't ever really think about the fact that an animal had to die in order to feed us. So that's actually a very significant spiritually based concept that a living creature died so we can feed our families, and we should be respectful of that. And I think we've lost that in many ways.
We really have we not?
Yeah, and then just the types of foods are so different. So traditional foods, like Kibby was saying, buffalo for protein, but also corn, beans, and squash. And the mixtures of the fruits and vegetables and choke cherries and the nutritional profiles of that are just wonderful. So when we think of traditional food now, a lot of people think of fry bread, fry bread is Indian fry bread, but we never fried dough. That's not actually a traditional American Indian food. Actually, the roots of fry bread are from the USDA Commodity Food Program. So the Commodity Food Program is a national program that feeds impoverished populations. And within that, there's what's called the Food Distribution Program on Indian Reservations, FDPIR. And when I was growing up, it included things, of course, like flour and sugar, some sort of spam-like meat product. I'm not exactly sure what that was.
What was in it?
Yeah. I'll say
And cheese.
Yep, government cheese.
Government cheese.
Yeah, that's where commodity cheese comes from.
All those good foods, you know,
Yeah.
cheese, flour,
sugar, lard, vegetable shortening.
lard.
They actually would distribute pure corn syrup, and it literally said on the label, "Use in your baby formula." I mean, this is
No kidding.
poison that was just basically perpetuated across multiple tribal populations. And I remember they would distribute what they would call grape juice, but I think it was just sugar water with purple food coloring. So I
Yep.
remember as kids, well, I had like the Kool-Aid smile from drinking that,
Yeah.
purple grape juice.
Well, I did too.
Yeah, but just in high concentrations, it's really bad food, and it leads to problems like diabetes and heart disease and other poor nutritionally related disease processes. And it's kind of disappointing, and I'm not sure the best way to resolve this, because when I go back home for ceremonies or
Right.
back home for a feast or a gathering, there's an expectation that there will be fry bread. And why? It's like, well, because it's traditional. It's like, well, actually, no, it's not. It's not our traditions. If we want to call it traditional food, it's traditional USDA food. It's not traditional Oyate food.
Oyate food.
You know, we never fried dough. And the flour that we use is, you know, it's the enriched flour with all the nutrients taken out and just the starch left behind. So it's the worst type of carbohydrate, and then deep fried and melted shortening, which is the worst type of fat.
Yeah.
And it causes disease.
Yeah.
So it is literally a poison. I wish we didn't have it, but when I talk about this with many family members, they just get angry with me because people love their fry bread. You know,
Yeah.
it's a comfort food in many ways. It's been acculturated. But if we're honest with ourselves, that's not the ways of our ancestors.
Fry bread is very close to pizza.
No, pizza's baked. Fry bread is deep fried and
Deep-
saturated in melted shortening.
Okay.
It's much, much worse.
Yeah. So part of we've talked about diet, but I do know that there was a period of time in the 1700s in the eastern part of the U.S. when the indigenous people were thought of as the healthiest people on this earth, and they believed that part of the reason was related to their knowledge of natural herbs and the medicines. But the real truth was it was a vigorous lifestyle, and they exercised. I mean, they were physically active. You know, it was a nomadic society, correct?
Yeah, and what's interesting, in many indigenous languages, there's no word for exercise. You know,
Oh, there isn't.
We didn't actually have to find time to go to the gym and get on the
No.
treadmill because we were so physically active just to survive. You know,
10 miles a day.
The lifestyle was very rigorous, required a great deal of physical strength. And when I think about my own ancestry, you know, and thinking back to Kyle, South Dakota, and I do have an image here of my great-great-grandfather,
Yeah.
Chief Stabber. This picture was taken in 1872, and he was part of the delegation of Lakota and Dakota leaders who went to Washington, D.C. when they were addressing some of the relationships between the tribal nations and the U.S. government. And I love this picture. You can see on his right braid, it's covered with the red cloth, and the left side is left open. And what I've learned from my ancestors is that when both of them are closed, that they have come to some sort of resolution, and that they've come to agreement. And what is symbolized here is that they had not yet come to a mutually beneficial agreement in their negotiations. So when I look at this, I think about how much courage he must have had to go from Kyle, South Dakota to Washington, D.C. on a train, never really having left this area on anything but a horse, and going to really a foreign arena with foreign language and trying to advocate for his people. And the strength of our people, not just physically, but also mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, to have the courage to do this is quite powerful. So this is Chief Stabber. His son was Crandall Stabber. Crandall's son was Louis Stabber. Louis's daughter was my mom, Beverly Stabber. So I'm a direct descendant of Chief Stabber, and he was from Medicine Root District in South Dakota. He's actually buried at the St. Barnabas Cemetery in Kyle.
I think about the negotiations that the leaders of the indigenous groups throughout our country did. Most of the politicians, however, failed on their side of the promise.
Yeah.
I mean, can you think of one treaty that there's a promise that has been kept?
Certainly not in this area. If we look at the main treaties for the Oyate, the Fort Laramie Treaty and other treaties, we were promised things like, in exchange for land and natural resources, we were supposed to have housing, education, and health care. And
housing, education, health care.
Yeah, in exchange for the land and natural resources. And that's through treaties. And treaties are the highest order of law in the land. That's in the U.S. Constitution. There's a treaty clause that recognizes that treaties are the highest order of law. And we have treaties between the tribal nations and the federal government. And those treaties do not have an expiration date. Those treaties are valid in perpetuity. And the reason why we have a Bureau of Indian Affairs, a Bureau of Indian Education, and an Indian Health Service is because of those treaties. And I look at the treaties really as a contract. These are contracts between the tribal nations and the federal government. And the significant underfunding of Indian Health Service is a treaty violation. The U.S. government is in breach of contract, quite honestly, and that is a contributing factor to the terrible health disparities that we see today.
Well, it's terribly underfunded.
Yeah.
We have a question. Rapid City Man is wondering when Indian Health Services built hospitals, and what year did they add dental and vision?
So IHS actually started as the Indian Health Service in 1955, but there was an Indian Health program that was operated through the Bureau of Indian Affairs prior to that. So the original funding or the law that allowed for recurrent funding of Indian health programs was the Snyder Act in the 1920s. And the Snyder Act allowed Congress to appropriate funding. The terminology is from time to time, but it turned out to be annual appropriations for the Indian Health Program. This started going all the way back to the 1920s. So we have facilities that were built in the 1920s that are still being used. A lot of facilities were built in the 50s and 60s, and we have a huge backlog of need for services, for facilities and services. So for dental, that was provided. I know that there were dentists that worked for BIA in the 1950s. I'm not sure when vision care was offered through Indian Health Service. That's a very good question.
Okay. Yeah, addressing the high cancer death rate in the American Indian population is among the goals of a program called Walking Forward.
We've been investigating ways to lower the cancer death rates for American Indians on the Northern Plains since 2002 through a variety of interventions, including community patient navigation, cancer education, access to cancer screening and detection, and ultimately access to clinical trials with innovative treatments to hopefully improve the cure rates for American Indians. Some of the measures of success include, most importantly, establishing a trusting partnership with tribal leaders and the community staff since 2002, enrolling over 4,500 American Indians on various clinical protocols, and some data that would suggest that patients with screen-detectable cancers are now presenting with earlier stages of disease. Palliative care is almost non-existent in tribal communities. Some of the reasons include lack of transportation and the distances that patients have to travel. As a result, many patients die at home with inadequate palliative care. So symptoms such as pain control, anxiety, psycho-emotional factors, it's been shown that early intervention with addressing these symptoms can actually help improve the patient's quality of life. So how are we going to move forward with implementing this palliative care project? And it's divided into 3 phases. Phase 1 is reaching out to the community, having listening or talking circles with community members that include tribal leaders, spiritual leaders, healthcare providers, former cancer patients, to really get an idea of what the community needs are. Right now we're in the middle of a large-scale lung cancer screening project for all patients at risk in western South Dakota. What we see, especially in the American Indian population, is that they have the highest cancer death rates from lung cancer. There's high smoking rates, and you couple those two together with the fact that we actually have an effective screening test for lung cancer. So the screening test we're implementing is called an LDCT, or low-dose CT scan. It's a 1-minute scan, no IV contrast, and it's highly effective in picking up early-stage lung cancer. Early-stage lung cancer, like other screen-detectable cancers, is very curable if caught early. We've estimated that there's 14,000 patients at risk for developing lung cancer. So by implementing the current strategy of reaching out to the community, as well as doing provider workshop for healthcare providers, our goal is to screen over 1,000 patients in the next 2 to 3 years. As a treating oncologist, I have no impact on how patients present in the clinic. Over the last 20 years, I've seen many patients present with very advanced stages of disease where they potentially could have been treated and diagnosed at an earlier stage. So with the strategies of walking forward that focus on community education, patient navigation, access to screening, the hope is that these patients will present with earlier stages of cancer. And there is a suggestion in the last 10 years that we're seeing that.
So thank you, Dr. Peter, who is a radiation oncologist, but doing research and support in indigenous peoples. It's really great to see this happening. What about cancer in that group? What is your take?
Well, I was on the National Board of Directors for American Cancer Society for a number of years, only American Indian physician to serve on the national board, which is really unfortunate. We need more of us in those leadership roles. But what I see, in addition to higher rates of smoking and diet-related higher risk for cancer and less resources to support adequate screening, we also have a lot of unresolved trauma. We have historical trauma and adverse childhood experiences that lead to higher risk for multiple diseases, including cancer. We actually see higher rates of cancer when people have unresolved trauma.
So let's talk about historical trauma syndrome. I think it was somebody from South Dakota, a woman, who named it, and I can't remember her name.
Maria Yellowhorse Briefhart. She's my cousin, actually. Yeah.
So I mean, there is a real deal. Explain that, where it fits. Let's even talk about Black Americans.
So any population who's undergone significant traumas, there's been a lot of research even with the Jewish population, the survivors of the Holocaust from World War II, and populations who undergo cataclysmic events or significant traumas as a population, they tend to have worse health status, and that is also translated to their children. So we actually see changes in health status from people who suffer traumatic events, and that can be passed on from one generation to the next.
And so, I mean, 400 years of, let's say 250 years of slavery, 150 years of trying to come out of it, the bigotry that's out there, they're still suffering from this kind of thing, and you see that in the Black population, but you also see that in the American Indian population.
Yeah, and we actually do see with toxic stress, there's actually changes to DNA. There's a whole emerging science of epigenetics, where you see changes to DNA based on toxic stress, and that can be passed from one generation to the next. I think that will be a scientific platform that allows us to better understand historical trauma and diseases like cancer.
But you said the word ACE. Could you explain what ACE is?
Adverse childhood experiences. And there's a very good study that showed the more adversity someone suffers in childhood, the worse their health status is as adults. And when we see populations that are marginalized, discriminated against, and live in poverty, we tend to see more adversity during childhood.
And the adverse events that a child could have to face would be?
Yeah, well, in the ACE study, they looked at different types of abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction, and 10 different categories of adversity that can lead to higher rates of chronic disease and mental health conditions.
And you told me earlier that it's a linear deal. The more adverse events, the more health problems later on.
In those 10 categories, someone can have an ACE score of 0 to 10, and the higher the ACE score, the worse the health status.
We're getting some great questions. Thank you. A woman from Brookings is commenting that healthy eating should be promoted for those that are not Native Americans as well.
Absolutely, yeah. I wish we had better access to healthier foods, and that's a policy issue. We tend to subsidize farmers to grow things like corn that becomes ethanol, soybeans that becomes biodiesel. What if we subsidized healthy tomatoes and healthy fruits?
I mean, why not improve the quality of the food that we're eating?
Everyone.
For everyone.
Absolutely.
A T South Dakota man is wondering what Native Americans do to preserve food for the winter time. Do they have items to stow in their pantries as well?
Yeah, so of course in modern times, it's a completely different world with freezers and storage of food, and we have, unfortunately, food that's inexpensive that has a lot of preservatives that can be stored at room temperature. But historically we'd have a lot of dried meats, but we also had a mixture of shredded buffalo with choke cherries mixed in together, and that could be stored for long periods of time, and it was very, very tasty food. Yeah.
There's an industry in one of the reservations that does that mixture.
Very similar, yeah, the Tonka bars, and they use blueberries instead of
choke
cherries, yeah.
But choke cherries are kind of, I mean, I used to eat choke cherry.
Yeah.
They're
wonderful.
tart.
Well, I think they taste great, especially mixed together with the shredded buffalo.
Wow.
Yeah.
Another T man is wondering if the life expectancy of Native Americans is low. What was the life expectancy of Native Americans in the 1800s or even in the 1700s?
Yeah, so we know that life expectancy for everyone was very low in the 1800s, mainly because of infectious disease. So with higher rates of infectious disease, life expectancy was not uncommon to be in the mid-40s, actually, back at that time for everybody. But as we've seen improvements in sanitation and antibiotics, life expectancy increased significantly to about the mid-70s by the year 2000. So we went from mid-40s to mid-70s, a 30-year increase in life expectancy, and that was enjoyed by everyone in this country except for Northern Plains American Indians. And it's not because of infectious disease, it's higher rates of chronic disease and also things like higher rates of infant mortality, unintentional injury-related deaths, and suicide, unfortunately.
Suicide.
Yeah.
Any comments about suicide?
I think that's another manifestation of unresolved trauma. We have so much work to do to look at the impact of unresolved trauma, whether it's historical trauma, adverse childhood experiences, the forced boarding school experiences that we haven't had a chance to talk about. A lot of traumatic events that are concentrated in some populations, including Northern Plains American Indians, and we see all kinds of bad outcomes as a result.
I listened to a lecture by somebody who stated that she sensed that the spirit of the people in this country is falling. There's a spiritual vacuum happening, and it's reflected on the significant increase in suicide in all populations, and the opioid overdoses that are going on.
Yeah, and I think if we look at this from a holistic perspective or medicine wheel perspective, we have to recognize that there's spiritual, mental, physical, and emotional forces that are all at play at the same time.
And I am with you 100% on that.
And when people have significant emotional trauma, or perhaps they have spiritual imbalance or ill health because of trauma, difficulty trusting, difficulty in relationships, difficulty in connecting with one another, we can see all kinds of bad manifestations. And I think people self-medicate with things like opioids or alcohol, or even food. People are self-medicating unresolved trauma, and eventually some people get to the point where they choose suicide, which is just a tragedy, and it's preventable.
And it's preventable.
Yeah.
Some people say that we just live on this world in a predestined way, that this is one religious belief, that predestination is all there, we're just going through the line. Then there are others who say everything that we do is our choice, that we aren't controlled by anything, and that we direct our future. Spiritually, how would you
well, I think we're all given special skills and special opportunities, and everyone's different. There's not a kind of a one-size-fits-all blanket approach, and we do believe that we are all related. We say mitakuye oyasi, which means we are all related, or we all are all connected.
Say that again.
And mitakuye oyasi, which means we are all related. But I think one of the challenges is that we've lost that sense of connectivity with each other. I think that we unfortunately have a lot of interracial tensions. We certainly have international tensions, cross-religious tensions that are so unnecessary. And when we marginalize people, we create traumas. And when we create traumas, we create inequities. And I think about this from further upstream and from a deeper spiritual perspective. If we had that spiritual connectedness with one another and truly believed that we were all related, that we would start to resolve some of the societal influences that are leading to disparities.
That's well put, Don. Thank you. A Brookings woman is wondering if celiac disease is a prevalent issue in Native American populations, since wheat wasn't necessarily introduced into their ancestry diet. And that's the question: was there wheat in the mid-1800s in your population?
Certainly not in the way it is now. You know, wheat wasn't one of our traditional staples. You know,
Right.
so corn, beans, squash, certainly buffalo, but not wheat. So wheat was introduced at a later time. You know, it's interesting when I look at the traditional diet and the different sources of protein, you know, beans being a legume, squash is a fruit, corn is a vegetable, and we had hundreds of types of each of those varieties. We had such a diverse diet and very healthy foods. And what I see now is that foods that are easily processed, like wheat and sugar, are put into just about everything. Corn syrup is in just about everything. We're creating these sources of calories that don't have nutritional value, and we're seeing poor health outcomes and things like celiac and other related conditions across populations.
But so you are seeing some celiac disease in.
There is some, yeah, but of course it had not historically been one of our challenges.
Right. A Wallace, South Dakota viewer wants to discuss the issue of human trafficking on the reservation and amongst the American Indian population.
Another huge challenge. We do have a whole issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women. We're just finally starting to understand some of the data around this, but when we look at all populations for Indigenous peoples in the US and Canada, certainly here in the Dakotas, there's a lot of young women who are missing or murdered. And quite often the missing young girls are put into human trafficking and in the sex trade and taken from impoverished communities into other populations, and it's just absolutely horrible. I mean, these are human beings, and we're not addressing this issue nearly with enough resources or vigor that we need to, because this is just a travesty.
And I don't know how to fix it. I mean, that's part of this whole problem. How can we fix it? And of course, the worst thing you want is I'm a white man, come to help you save your problems. You know, I mean, that's not accepted too well on the
And I think that's why we need more of our own people going into leadership roles. You know, we need to be making policy, not responding to it. And that's why, in my role, I'm hoping to be a part of building the next generation of health leaders from Indigenous populations.
After this short break, please stay tuned for the important takeaway messages from our guest, as well as the answers to tonight's Prairie Doc quiz question.
It is time for us to turn over control of the questions to you, our audience. It is our first Ask Anything of the season. Next time on Call with the Prairie Doc.
On Call with the Prairie Doc is very important to a lot of people in this area and in this region, because it communicates a lot of very valuable information on healthcare. This project takes dollars. We have a great foundation called the Healing Words Foundation that oversees this whole operation and is responsible for some of the fundraising to promote these programs. So the website is prairiedoc.org, O-R-G, prairiedoc.org. Go there, donate if you're so inclined, and we thank you very much.
So, what would you say would be the most important things that our audience would take away? I mean, what are the issues that we want them to remember from tonight, Don?
Well, we do have terrible disparities on a number of fronts, but there's also things that we can do about it. And what I would love for the future, a vision for the future, is that our populations have more respect for each other and actually integrate as one group of human people. And I think spirituality has a lot to do with that. And being truly spiritually connected, I don't know of any religion that genuinely believes hate is an option. I wish we didn't have discrimination, but we do. And you know, from a traditional Lakota perspective, we recognize that spirituality is just as important in health as the physical health. And in my own training, the only time we talked about spirituality was when I was doing hospice rotations. It's got to be incorporated sooner than that.
We need it more. We need more of it. And now for the winner of tonight's Prairie Doc quiz question. The overall median age at death in South Dakota is 76.5 years. However, the American Indians in South Dakota is A, 48, B, 58, C, 68, D, 78 years. And the answer is B, 58 years. And the winner is Leona Kennedy from Sioux Falls. Thank you, Leanna, for participating, and a book will be in the mail to you soon. We'll be right back after this.
Have you heard? The Prairie Doc has a radio show. Listen to your local radio station for Prairie Doc Conversations. This program features physicians and other health professionals discussing various medical topics important to you and your family. Ask your local radio station if they broadcast Prairie Doc Conversations.
Thank you for listening. Until next time, stay healthy out there, people. Starting in 1805 through 1858, the Dakota Indian people living in Minnesota were, by U.S. government treaties, gradually cut out of their traditional hunting areas. In 1861, crops failed, winter was severe, meager federal payments were late, and Dakota children were starving. By August of 1862, desperation moved some of the Dakota Indians to attack white homestead farmers and families, and the state militia responded. War was on. After 6 weeks of fighting, the Dakota warriors surrendered, and 303 men were sentenced to death by hanging. President Abraham Lincoln commuted many, but left 38 Dakota men to hang in Mankato, Minnesota, just after Christmas, 1862. Those commuted were shipped to prison in Iowa, where more than a third died as conditions were so poor. Although many Indian people did not go to war, white hatred of all Indians grew like a prairie fire. Within a year, a $25 bounty was paid for the scalp of any Dakota Indian found free within that state. Lives were lost on both sides of that war, but the Dakota Oyate means people, lost their lands, and their culture, pride, and family traditions were severely compromised, affecting many generations to come. First introduced by mental health expert Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart, historical trauma response, or HTR, is a societal diagnosis now used by psychologists and historians. It refers to the cumulative transgenerational traumatic experience which causes long-lasting injury to communities, cultures, and descendants, like that of the American Indians. Another example of HTR is the 400-year African-American slave experience. Experts state that HTR may cause smoldering animosity between the groups, as well as poverty, alcohol abuse, violence, depression, and suicidal behaviors. How can this be treated without compromising a culture's traditions? Do ancestors of immigrant Europeans have a societal responsibility to right a wrong? Does smoldering animosity block the path to healing? I believe prejudice hurts all of us. Hate poisons the well, even if it is inherited hate that came from more than 200 years of conflict and violence. It is time for European descendants to free ourselves from the bonds of historical bigotry, better understand the perspective of the Indian people. It's time for people of all races to stop hating and find ways for cultural healing through spiritual kindness to each other. Dakota leader and mystic Black Elk said, "The bison were the gift of a good spirit, and from the same good spirit we must find another strength." Well, a great big thank you to our guest, Dr. Don Warne. Thank you so much, Don, for volunteering to come to our studio in Yeager Hall on the campus of South Dakota State University and add his experience and knowledge to our discussion tonight. Well, it's that time of year again. The official time for flu shots starts October 1st. Please get your flu shot. It's important not just for you, but to help protect those around you. That does it for tonight from all of us here at On Call with the Prairie Doc. Until next time, stay healthy out there, people.
Major funding for On Call with the Prairie Doc has been provided by
Avera is a proud sponsor of On Call with the Prairie Doc on South Dakota Public Broadcasting. Larson Manufacturing is proud to support On Call with the Prairie Doc as it continues to open doors for important medical information.
And by the South Dakota Foundation for Medical Care, the Medicare Quality Improvement Organization for South Dakota,
and with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions.
Brookings Health System,
Ophthalmology Limited,
Avera Heart Hospital,
Dakota Allergy and Asthma,
Fishback Financial Corporation,
Vance Thompson Vision,
Urology Specialists,
Brown Clinic,
American Academy of Family Physicians Foundation and South Dakota Academy of Family Physicians,
Black Hills Medical Society,
Aberdeen District Medical Society,
Brookings Madison District Medical Society,
Sioux Falls District Medical Society,
Dakota Bank,
Orthopedic Institute,
Physicians Care Sanford Clinic Community Service Committee,
Aberdeen Asthma and Allergy,
and Swiftel Communications.